from? The service sector, for example, contributed 44% to our GDP, service sector itself, at least according to that. And of course, it was followed by industrialization at 26% and agriculture at 23%. So from the figures, you're looking at the service sector, and it employs so many people. And the service sector too includes the very people you've been talking about, the education sector, that in my view was employing, according to the statistics from UBOS, over 20 million Ugandans employed by the education sector. So I think you're right to think that the Ministry of Finance needs also to factor them in. And how do we help the service sector get back into business, even amidst this pandemic? I know we're going to talk about industrialization, but I want us to be alive to the fact that the service sector contributes greatly to the GDP. Someone who no longer opens their schools because of COVID-19, and remember how they are badly hit. Let's address those people.
Sectors at least sustain the little momentum which had developed when the partial lockdown was being lifted. The answer lies in, I think, in my opinion, 3 areas. Area number 1, with respect to education and maybe tourism and these other service sectors, is unfortunately going to hit on the expenditure side again with respect to what we ought to do. Namely, within these 42 days, it is very important that the health sector, together with the education sector, implement a number of measures that may mitigate a continued lockdown after the 42 days. What are these kind of measures? For example, it is necessary that while vaccination of all teachers must be done before the 42 days, if the vaccine becomes available, because I'm told also that there may be a constraint there. But I think if the vaccine becomes available, it's very important to start vaccination of the teachers, so that at least by the time we reach the 42 days, every person who is going to be in contact with the pupils becomes vaccinated. Number 2, it will also be very important to address the issue which I saw from the private school operators, which was a proposal that they need to be assisted to have isolation facilities in their schools, or at least group schools around a radius of, say, 5 to 10 kilometers, where if a pupil or a student is identified to be having this virus, is isolated from the rest, that's after 42 days, and put in that facility, and that facility must be linked with the referral health system, so that the presence of sick students or teachers in schools is quickly linked up with evacuation. As I said, unfortunately, that requires a physical expansion to have facilities grouped around areas of a radius of, say, 10 kilometers. I'm not a public health expert, but I think this is the kind of thinking that ought to be going on if we are to mitigate further damage by further extensions of this. The third issue, which also requires another physical expansion, is certainly to have the health workers who are competent enough to handle the isolated cases in those areas where the isolated people are, give the basic treatments and so on and so forth, and also be able then to relay them to the next level of the medical care. The third area, which I think all of us are now familiar with, oxygen is running out everywhere. Oxygen is running out everywhere. So I think the expansion of the capacity to produce oxygen to supply those areas and hospitals, the areas that I mentioned about, for quick attention of the qualified medical personnel to administer it, because I had a program this morning. Doctors are saying, please don't buy a cylinder of oxygen and go and pump yourself in the house. So it's necessary to have, as you expand the number of medical people to attend to those who are falling sick, it's also necessary to expand the requirement for the facilities. Together with oxygen then is the therapy that we are talking about. What is it that we're using now to keep 98%? Not everybody who gets COVID dies. So to keep 98% alive, what is it that we are doing? Of course, SOPs is a LCM. SOPs must be there. That will be the starting point. But those SOPs must also be practiced in all schools. And that's what I said is another expansion of the fiscal side. To have education sector open up, to have tourism sector. What I'm talking about in education can also be extended to oxygen, etc., etc.
Whereas I hear you loud and clear, I think that the Minister of Finance and indeed government is going to face a very, very tough time, because especially this financial year, I read in the newspapers recently that there were over 150 schools that were being auctioned. The owners are giving them out because they can no longer afford the loans. I think that's what Michael was trying to say, that some people were saying, can we refer the loans? The banks themselves are also under pressure to meet their targets. There's a lot of pressure on businesses, and we'll talk about the SMEs. And this is where I want to bring you in, Julius. It's going to be a very delicate one, especially this financial year, with the service sector. I thought we could do a round on the service sector. With the service sector, which is employing many people, which is largely affected, and they're very people who actually pay the taxes. I wanted you to weigh in on that delicate balance, and what do you think that this budget is going to do to help address the challenges in the service sector? Because, to be honest, it really employs so many people and it contributes largely to the GDP.
Thanks, Solomon. I'll take on to where the governor has almost stopped. I think the interventions of Bank of Uganda have almost reached their limit. Probably, I don't know if they have more space to do that. Maybe that alone. So the 60 billion that now is there for this service sector, what should we do? And I think for me that's a very good starting point. One of the things I think needs to be done, of course, is can we provide relief to these particular sectors? And it goes to my point of, for any policy that we are developing, it must be specific to target particular areas or sectors that are heavily being affected by COVID. So it's not only education, but probably it's also these other small and medium enterprises. The only challenge that is there is how do you do that? Which instrument can you do to ensure that it's not abused? In some countries, you go and buy off these sectors. Hopefully, when they recover, they can be able to pay back and you recover your money. But in an area where you find the school's ownership, you even don't know who owns it, it does not keep the books of account, it is not contributing to URA in terms of tax returns, it becomes a bit of a challenge in this country. It's not only that, but probably others. So what should we do? I think it's quite very important that in this country, we need to have registration of these businesses so that we can be able to track them properly. So that in terms of crisis like this, if you're able to provide this kind of relief, there is the way that you will track this relief and it will be able to bring it back. So that's point number one. Point number two for me is on the issue of, in terms of what we need also to do is, I know the pressures in URA, the revenues are not coming up. We are hitting very hard on them that we are borrowing so much. And now we are telling them, please expand. We need some more money. So probably if you go to the governor, can you print some more notes? The governor will say, please, I can't print more notes. It can't be an option. But there is an option that can happen. And the option is in terms of looking at the efficiency levels within what we do. To the extent that I was really very happy to listen to the budget speech to say they're actually going to save 800 billion out of consumptive expenditures to cut them down. I was like, okay, this is a very good measure. it's very important that we become frugal in this particular area. Where should we spend money and know that we're going to get some returns, and where should we not and postpone those particular expenditures? That is very important, so that we can have some small monies to help us deal with these coming problems. Because otherwise, we are really between a hard rock and a stone in terms of what we can do. The only thing is to save in terms of consumptive expenditures. And that goes on with even our communities. If you're asking for a new district, if you're asking for a new city, if you're asking for a new member of parliament, if you want to have a new, just know that those resources that you're asking, that those things you're asking for need resources. So if we can stop those demands. Lastly, is the whole thing about for me is closing leakages within our system. It's quite very important. Let us ensure that what we spend, we can be able to account for it. It is very important that we spend on the right things and the right people actually benefit from these amounts of money. So if we are going to say we are supporting education institutions, thank you very much. Let us have a list on the notes board so that we all know which institutions are being supported. But if that list comes out and we find that actually half of them are not education institutions, then the idea of supporting education institutions so that they can be able to recover is gone. And the same thing with everything is that we need transparency and accountability, even when we are in this particular crisis, because we are being told do everything but keep the receipts. But if at the end of the day we have no receipts to show, then I can tell you that the impact of COVID is going to be even much worse than what we're expecting at this particular moment. I thank you.
I think Julius raises very serious points here, and Julius, we will hint on that just shortly. But let's cross over and talk to Dr. Joseph Muvawala, who is the Executive Director of the National Planning Authority. We've had conversations around planning for this country and budgeting differently. We have the National Development Plan 3, which I know is anchored on industrialization and the resource allocations in the budget. So I want to see what he thinks about it. Dr. Joseph, thanks for joining us this morning. Does this budget fit very well? Does it pass the test of the National Development Plan? Are we putting money? You know, I was once with Joseph one day, I think one of the readings of the national budget, and then he gave me a scenario of a family. You have plans, I am going to do A, B, C, D, E, but when the money comes, you actually spend it elsewhere, and then you want to, at the end of the year, see how far have you gone with the implementation of your plan at family level. And so he helped me understand that. Joseph, come in. Do you think that this time around, the budgeting process has tried to fit into the industrialization agenda as detailed in the ministerial policy statement, the financial statement for this year's budget? Dr. Joseph.
Thank you very much. This is critical. Whether our budget has been allocated to the areas we think are critical, mainly industry. Now, the answer is yes and no. We are operating in very unusual conditions right now. I do not expect the budget this year to be able, we have problems that we are dealing with. I can tell you that while we have a and I'm using the need to be fair to our colleagues. We have a discretion. Yeah, we have a discretion problem. Do we have the space that we need to be able to spend on? We have made some expenditures fine, but it has not covered the most important parts of our industrialization agenda. Dr. Ting has alluded to the issue of maize. We produced maize. We are going to continue producing maize, but we have a standard problem. And we have not allocated money to standards. It means we will continue spending, producing maize and not be able to export. Why? Our budget, we have a wage, which is almost bloated. So when we get resources, the first call on our resources is wage. The second call on our resources is security. So what do you remain with? So the issue right now that we need to do within the budgets of the different sectors is to prioritize. We must prioritize. Otherwise, I don't think we have done justice. Not because we don't want, but because the situation in which we find ourselves is very, very complicated. I don't know whether you get me loud up here.
Yeah, we've missed some bits, but we have got the core of it. And let me put that exactly to Untitled here.
Yeah.
You just heard it from the man who plans for this country. He really takes time, and I need to admit that Dr. Joseph Muvala is a very brilliant man, one of the Uganda's best brains, at least in my view, that I've interfaced with. He sits down with his team, plans for this country, and yet your allocations are elsewhere. So you're spending a lot, about 5.5 trillion shillings into wages and salaries, according to this budget. You have the security again taking the lion's share. And he's complaining. He's saying, guys, we are thinking about constructing 23 industrial parks, as detailed in the National Development Plan. We are thinking big into industrialization, and yet you're allocating money elsewhere. You are literally... disheartening the man himself. You've heard him. Untitled. Do you want to comment on this? Are we getting our priorities right in this case, as Dr. Muvala was saying?
Yes, we are getting our priorities right, except the resource envelope is very limited. And
I've heard that before, Untitled.
I think Doctor knows very well where we are coming from. I think with respect to the program allocations, I heard him talking about sectors again, which was difficult for me to comprehend. I thought we had moved away from sectors to programs. And the programs which are getting more money is actually agro-industrialization. And you may say that let's look at the components, the essential components of each of those programs and see where the money is going under each of those programs. About 7.7 choice of where we want the industrialization agenda and the thematic areas of the budget for next financial year to go. The decomposition into wage and non-wage and development can also be disaggregated, and you can clearly see that the wage component is going up. It's not actually going to wages of this administrative cadre, no. It's going to wages of scientists. The increase in nurses that I was talking about, I was not talking from the blue. I knew there is a need for us to increase the wage bill for us to link the necessary part of our health care with the necessary delivery under the program. So
let's also admit that whereas there are key priority sectors, we have an increased administrative wage bill. I mean, looking at our parliament, our executive, I think, yes, and I say thank you for looking into the issue of medical workers, but the significant chunk of the money is going into public administration and wages, rather than putting it into the core priority area, which is industrialization. And that's what Joseph was trying to say.
Yes, there's money going to administration, public administration, but that's the cost you have to pay for the political economy arguments. I didn't expand Parliament. Parliament expanded. So you must provide for wage. You can't wish it away. So
you say I don't have money for you. And,
no.
Because
but it's not to
you
say...
You plan for this country,
yes,
Untitled. So you cannot just say that Parliament is expanding and I have to look for money to pay salaries. You say I don't have those resources, period.
I said so also. Now,
thank you.
Now, let's come back to the issue. I think the ultimate objective is really that we must be able to see that money has gone into the areas that we think are going to deliver. It's not going to be an overnight affair. We are going to continuously emphasize the incremental allocations in the subsequent financial years. We're not going to deliver NDP in 1 year. No. We're going to deliver it in a 5-year period. But have we started the journey? Yes. In which programs? Those programs that I think we shall be able to get the detail about in order for us to start the journey and continue measuring. And what we can do is not control the past. We cannot. It is to control the future. And I agree with Julius when he says we should stop certain public administration expenses expanding. With respect to debt, I think we have no choice, because when revenue collapsed, we had to borrow more in order to sustain the activities of the economy. So I think these are the kind of trade-offs you have to make when you're allocating resources to various competing demands.
Patrick, we'll talk about debt in our last round, and I thought that we could talk a little bit more about and you know, the government has a plan of setting up 23 industrial parks. The president is always launching industries and factories in different industrial parks. Michael, let me draw you into this conversation as BOU, but also as an observer on what's happening in this country. So the plan that government is looking at is to provide cheap capital to people who are going to be investing in industrialization. Patrick made that in his opening remarks. And let me just make it very clear in this budget. Part of the allocations that government is going to do, government is going to give the Uganda Development Bank a further 103 billion in this financial year, 2021-2022. And that's in addition to the already recapitalization that they were given. That's about 555 billion shillings, which was disbursed in the previous financial year. And that is so much to help small and medium enterprises affected by COVID-19 and other industries. They're also looking at, putting money in the microfinance support center to help the SMEs. But I also know that the agriculture credit facility under the Bank of Uganda is one that government will be injecting money. Do you think that these figures can go beyond text and become alive and can be used up by the people who need this money? And I'm not being pessimistic, and Ochelap is laughing at me, but I'm just trying to say, will manufacturers and people in the industrialization sector have an opportunity of getting this money? And I did an investigation into this, you know that, so I know exactly where this is. So do you want to lay Ugandans' fears of Ugandans and to the manufacturers out there who are looking for cheap capital, that this very money will actually be accessed to help them recover and help the economy to bounce back? Michael.
Thank you so much. I think the size, the demand for resources that is needed for recovery is quite enormous. And what the budget has provided may not fully meet it, all right? Like the PS has mentioned, the resources are very scarce. So this is trying to show something that we're doing something. But in terms of the meeting the real need, I don't think it's the case. So if you were to ask me what needs to be fundamentally done to address the issue of capital, now, you see, there are two issues here. There's working capital, and then there's the real creation of capital. Those two need different types of financing. What is happening in our economy today? Commercial banks that operate at the short end of the market, they mobilize deposits 1-2 years maximum, and maybe now they got something. You know, you find these guys who own schools going to a commercial bank to borrow a loan for 10 years. Now, a commercial bank, because its liabilities at the short end of the market, is trying to create long-term assets. A 10-year loan to a guy who's constructing a school. So how do they close that maturity mismatch? They have to go to the interbank, do this and this, and that's very expensive. So we need to address the issue of long-term capital mobilization. And that's why I go back to the reforms in the National Social Security Fund are very, very critical in this. Look at the liability structure of NSSF. It's long-term. But where are they investing their money? They're buying treasury bills, bonds, they're constructing buildings. Now, if you ask me what is the rate of return on this compared to if this money were to be invested in capital projects, budget could maybe be partly covered, okay? And then the other thing that we have to look at is Bank of Uganda has extended the yield curve. We now have 20 years, thanks to the Treasury for recently issuing a 20-year bond. So we have extended the yield curve to 20 years. So now we have 2, 3, 5, 10, 15, and I think 20. Now, what does this do? I think this yield curve is providing a benchmark for private sector to begin pricing their own resource mobilization. So the issue is, why can they do it? It goes back to the issues that Julius mentioned. Even our private sector, we are not my friend Mr. Chailap, in the year ending 30th June, is borrowing 6.8 trillion shillings from this small market here. You know what 6.8 trillion shillings is?
He's competing with the private sector.
Exactly. So pricing them out.
Shame on you, Mr. Chaila.
Pricing them
You're
out.
going to get all this money from the domestic market, and the private sector has to compete with government. Michael, please go ahead.
Pricing them out in terms of price and also quantity. But I don't blame him entirely, because the performance of the Uganda Revenue Authority has been below par as a result of the COVID-19. So what kind of counter-cyclical policy measure do you undertake? Then you need to increase your own domestic borrowing. After all, commercial banks also were not lending to the private sector because they were risk averse, that if I give you credit, your school is closed, how are you going to repay it? So they were washed with liquidity. They didn't know what to do. So government provided an avenue for them. So what is important is, what does the PSSU do with that money that they're borrowing? Are they going to rekindle growth from that money? So that is the critical issue. And I think Mr. Chailab should address it, that the money he borrowed, what did he use it for? I think that's what he should answer. Then we can go ahead.
No, I agree with you, Mr. Chailab, but that will come in after Julius. You get this money. Where do you put it? Yeah. I thought you would put it back into the private sector to help it recover, but you'll be answering that shortly. Julius, your thoughts on that issue? Access to cheap credit for the private sector in a long term so that it can, help in the manufacturing and production.
Yes, I think he just put it right today. The whole thing around the maturity mismatch. Yes, we have those manufacturers who want 10-year, 20-year, loan period. We also have the grain millers who probably want 2 to 3 year loan period. I think it goes back to my first point, to have targeted policy actions. If we know we are going to do industrialization, we need long-term capital. Is it there? And that's why I go back to China. Is he providing it? Is UDB ready to provide that? But also I want to see my grain millers get something to be able to to start and produce this particular add value to maize